Hello everyone, thanks for joining me again today. Psalm 121 is where our focus is today, the second of the Songs of Ascent. It's our final study for the week. Pick it up again on Monday, and we look forward to seeing you with us, of course, for Church at Home this coming Sunday. Now, Psalm 121 is probably a favorite psalm of yours. It's one of the great psalms of the Bible. I lift up my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth, or the maker of heaven and earth. And then this wonderful description of God as our helper. It speaks of great trust in the Lord. And in terms of the structure of the psalm, because looking at the structure of the psalm is quite key in terms of understanding it, hearing its message, appreciating its form, its shape, and the argument or the point that the psalm is making. In terms of the structure of this psalm, the structure is actually very simple. We have in verse 1 and 2 a kind of an introduction, a declaration of the Lord as the one in whom our trust should be placed, the Lord who is our helper, that very wonderful picture. And then in verse 3 through to verse 8, we have, if you like, an exposition of the way in which God is the helper. So there's an introduction and there's an exposition of the main point that the introduction sets before us. A theme, if you like, in the introduction, and then the exposition of that theme in the verses. Now, notice also, just have a look there, you'll notice that Psalm 121 verse 1 and verse 2 is very personal. I lift my eyes to the Lord, to the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. See that? I and my, and the idea of God being my help for the individual psalmist. But from verse 3 through to verse 8, you'll notice we switch from I and my to you and your. And of course, then the reference is also to Israel, verse 4. So we go both from the individual to the community. And both matter. Pilgrimage is not just about an individual journey with the Lord, but it is about a journey in community. Often these pilgrims would have traveled up to Jerusalem in groups. If we think about Mary and Joseph on their way to the city of David for the census, or the family journeying up to Jerusalem, that famous story in Luke where Jesus stays behind in the temple and they think he's with the other people. This idea of traveling in pilgrimage as an individual, as part of a community. These are key Bible ideas. The Christian life is never meant to be lived alone, as a single person on a single journey. We journey in community, and I think this time of separation and social distance has reminded us, has it not, of just how important that community is for maintaining the faith and sustaining our Christian walk. So there's this picture of the individual, there's this picture of the community, but the dominant picture in the psalm is the Lord himself. The Lord appears right through the psalm, either known as the Lord or He, and constantly we are being told of what the Lord does for His people. A wonderful explanation of how God is our helper. There's a question around the hills in verse 1. So some people say that the hills here is the place of anxiety and uncertainty. It's traveling on the road, there are all these hills, and they may be full of brigands or robbers. So you think about the story of the Good Samaritan and the traveler on the way down, and the brigands who overcame him and robbed him. But actually, it's more likely that the image of the hills is not an image of danger and uncertainty, but one of safety, so that almost as if the pilgrim is raising his eyes towards the hills surrounding Zion, traveling up into the foothills and looking towards Mount Zion. And I think Psalm 123 verse 1 just underlines that for us. Look at Psalm 123 verse 1. To you, says the psalmist, I lift up my eyes. See again that idea of lifting up the eyes. I lift up my eyes to the hills. And Psalm 123 verse 1, I lift up my eyes to you, Lord. So probably most likely in 121 verse 1, the hills here is a positive image of the place where Yahweh dwells, Mount Zion. And so to lift up one's eyes to the hills is to lift up one's eyes to the Lord, to the place of help. Where does my help come from? The answer is, verse 2, my help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. So this great picture of trust, and especially of trust in the Lord our helper. Now we're going to come back to this idea of the Lord as our helper in just a moment and look at it in terms of its Old Testament background. But I just want you to notice for the moment that the Lord who is the helper is both the creator, verse 2, the Lord who made heaven and earth, and is the God of Israel, verse 4, the covenant Lord. So this is a typical Old Testament theme when it comes to Yahweh, the Lord, that Israel's God is the creator, and that the creator is Israel's God, and that the reason Israel can look to the Lord, or the pilgrim can look to the Lord for help, even far away from Jerusalem, even scattered in the world at large, is because the Lord, who is the helper, is also the creator. In other words, this is an image of power and of authority, but also of covenant faithfulness, the Lord of creation and the Lord of Israel. And of course we get that in the New Testament, where Jesus, who is God's Son, our Savior, the one who comes to save us from wrath and sin and death, is also the Lord through whom the world was made. So in the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, the Redeemer God, the God in whom we trust for the journey, is also the Creator God. And it's because He's the Creator that He's able to be the Redeemer. And because He's the Creator that we can trust Him in this journey of pilgrimage. That's why we can have this confidence in the Lord that the psalmist has in verse 1. This kind of confidence is completely misplaced in idols. Idols have no eyes, they cannot see, they have no ears, they cannot hear, they have no mouths, they cannot speak, they have no hands, they cannot help, is what the prophets often say in a sort of a parody of the idols and of idol worshippers. But the Lord, who is the creator of heaven and earth, is the Lord who is well able to help His people in all manner of circumstances. Hence the trust. Now you'll notice if you look through the actual structure of verses 3 to verse 8, so we're now looking not at the introduction but the exposition, you'll notice that the structure of that section is clustered around repeated ideas. So look at verse 3 and verse 4. What do you see there is repeated? Well, verse 3, slumber. Verse 4, slumber nor sleep. So here the idea is that the Lord who keeps us neither slumbers nor sleeps. He never takes time off. He's never away sleeping. Elijah, you remember, mocking Baal as maybe he's gone on a journey, maybe he's asleep. God is never like that. He neither slumbers nor sleep, and therefore He is always available to help. In the day, in the night, whenever it is, God is our helper, and He's always present, a very present help in times of trouble, as one of the great Psalms says, God is our refuge and strength. In verse 5 and 6, the image now shifts from the Lord who never slumbers or sleeps to the Lord who is our shade. Do you see that? The Lord is your keeper, the Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun shall not strike you by day, the moon by night. So here is God as the shade giver. Now, of course, in a world like Palestine, Judea, that part of the world where the sun beats down and it's hot and dry, desert land, especially traveling through the desert on pilgrimage, shade is of critical importance. You can't survive without shade. The moon striking you by night is interesting. And it may well be the picture here, either of the false gods, sun, moon gods, gods of the nations, not being able to affect you. In other words, the idols can't harm you. It may also be just the moon by night and the darkness and the fear and the dread that might come by that. And night's often a time of danger. So what we have here is day and night. There's protection, imaged by the Lord as the shade giver, the one who provides refuge. Those wonderful images of the Lord and Jesus Himself as the mother hen who gathers chicks under the wings to provide refuge. And then in 7 and 8, it's a more general promise of keeping from evil, keeping life, keeping going out, coming in from this time forth forever. So the whole of time, coming and going, all of life being kept from all evil. Now we need to come back to those two verses because they can be very, very badly misunderstood. Let's think now about the Lord as our helper, because that's the key idea in the psalm, that the Lord is the helper. And in Psalm 33 and verse 20, so just turn there now, please. Psalm chapter 33 and verse 20, we read these words, "Our soul waits for the Lord. He is our help and our shield." Verse 21, "Our heart is glad in him because we trust in his holy name. Let your steadfast love, O Lord, be upon us." If you go back to the beginning of Psalm 33, you'll see that it's a song of praise, of shouting of joy, praise befitting us, giving thanks to the Lord, singing songs for him because his word is upright. This is the great psalm which says that by the word of the Lord were the heavens made, his starry host by the breath of his mouth. So again, God is the creator. But then verse 7, you see, he gathers the waters of the sea in the heap, he puts the deep in storehouses. And this is not so much the Lord as the creator, as the Lord of the Redeemer in the Exodus. So as God gathered the seas in creation, so he gathered the sea in the Exodus to rescue his people from bondage. And how he brings the counsel of the nations to nothing, frustrates the plans of wicked peoples. His counsel he sees, he looks, he hears. The king is not saved, verse 16 of 33, by the great army, a warrior not delivered by great strength. The war horse is a false hope. For the eye of the Lord is on those who fear him. We wait for the Lord. He is our helper and our shield. So do you see the picture here? This idea of the Lord as the helper, which is a characteristic theme in the Old Testament. In fact, in Deuteronomy chapter 33 and verse 7, Judah is promised in the great blessing that is given by Moses. Judah is promised, "Hear, O Lord, the voice of Judah, and bring him to his people. With your hands contend for him, and be a help against his adversaries." So this image of Israel being rescued by the Lord from her enemies, Egypt, the pursuing armies, the Lord opening the sea, leading them through safety, leading them through the dangers of the wilderness, even when they sin, maintaining them and strengthening them and keeping them, bringing them into the promised land, giving them victory over their enemies, establishing them in the land, giving victory over the enemies. This whole idea of the Lord as the deliverer, the Lord as the helper of his people, the creator God who is the redeemer God, who fights for his people, who contends for his people, who brings help to his people. That's a fundamental idea throughout of the whole of the Old Testament. Day and night, neither sleeping nor slumbering, in all of life, in all of challenges, in coming out and going in, the Lord is our helper. So it's a magnificent song of praise for pilgrims, because life is it's uncertain, it's unpredictable. There are challenges. There's the sun, there's the moon, there's the enemies, there's all of life, there's evil, trouble outside, trouble inside, difficulties, burdens. And in all of that, our eyes are to be lifted up to the Lord, for he is our help, and from him our help comes, our creator and our redeemer. Now, there is a way of reading this psalm, which frankly is not only wrong, but in fact diabolical, satanic. That seems a strange thing to say, that there should be a satanic exposition. But of course, I'm referring now to a twisting of the psalm to mean that because this psalm says that God will help us in everything and no evil will befall us, that therefore as Christians life should always just go along the lines it ought to go. We should never have any trouble, never have any sickness, never have any loss or difficult circumstance, loss of job, loss of a loved one. Life should just go properly. A kind of a prosperity gospel of the Old Testament. In fact, the prosperity gospel teachers, who are false gospel teachers, often draw this prosperity gospel from the Old Testament and from twisting the scriptures. And the reason I spoke about a diabolical interpretation is because, of course, in Psalm 91, which has been so often quoted, misquoted in my opinion, in fact, not just in my opinion, but actually misquoted and misused in this whole issue of the COVID-19 thing and the pestilence, because, of course, it quotes pestilence and no pestilence will come near you. In Psalm 91, verse 11 and verse 12, he will command his angels concerning you to guard all your ways. On their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. You see, keeping you safe on the journey, that nothing will strike you, and you won't even stumble, lest your foot be moved. Verse 3, he'll not let your foot be moved. You won't even stub your toe. If you can take those statements and turn them into a kind of a weird prosperity belief that nothing bad will ever happen to you as a Christian. And that's what the devil said to Jesus. Jump off the temple because he'll give his angels command concerning you, won't strike your foot. Can you see how wrong that is? Jesus went through trials, tribulations, in the end the cross, and it was only in the resurrection that God vindicated him. So we need to understand that these Psalms, this promise about being kept, is about ultimate salvation. Not about being kept from this or that struggle or trouble or trial or burden, but ultimate salvation. That God in the end is faithful to his covenant and that he will in the end protect his people. Jesus said that in John's Gospel, those great prayers that Jesus prayed in the upper room, that none whom the Father had given him he would lose. And so as we move from Old Testament promises to New Testament promises, we understand that we're not talking about no trials and tribulations, but a God who is overall our Creator and who will redeem and deliver us in the end, even if we die, through the resurrection from the dead. Well, I'll leave you to think about that. It is a great psalm of praise, and I hope one that you will pray in times of trouble. On Monday, Psalm 122. Look forward to seeing you.